You might have heard of Jeffrey Dahmer before, but have you heard of the man that murdered him? In 1994, the man who killed one of America's most infamous serial killers wasn't a guard or another predator. It was a fellow inmate with a past of his own. Today's story is about a man named Christopher Scarver, the murder that first sent him to prison, and the shocking day that he took not one but two lives behind bars. It's a case that raises difficult questions about mental health, justice, and what happens when one notorious killer crosses paths with another. Welcome to the True Crime Nurse, everybody. My name is Kat, and I'm a registered nurse who loves all things nursing and true crime. Don't forget to subscribe and leave me a comment down below for any case recommendations that you have. Before we dive in, I just wanted to put a disclaimer out there that I really do try to focus on victims in every case, but today we're going to be talking quite a bit about Scarver because everything sort of centers around him today, including the murder of Jeffrey Dahmer. And sadly, there's not that much information online available about the victims that we're going to be talking about. I haven't seen anyone cover today's case, so I hope you're excited. Let's get started. Christopher Scarver was born on July 6th, 1969, and was raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was the second of 5 children in his family, and as a teenager, he attended James Madison High School in Milwaukee, but dropped out in the 11th grade. During this period of his life, Scarver actually began to use alcohol and marijuana pretty heavily, which those are both habits that contributed later to the turmoil in his life. His relationship with his mother fell completely apart because of his substance abuse, and it continued to escalate, so his mother kicked him out due to the drinking and drugs. This displacement from home left him essentially homeless at a really vulnerable age, coping with addiction and now without a support system. He began to job hunt pretty quickly in order to survive on his own and support himself, so Christopher found some direction through a new job training program. He was hired as a trainee carpenter in the work program that was run by the Wisconsin Conservation Corps, or WCC, which is a state-supported job corps that actually offers job and skill training to the youth. This job seemed to offer Scarver some sense of hope for a stable future. According to him, one of the supervisors in the program, a man named Edward Patz, had promised him that after completing the training, Scarver would be offered a permanent full-time position there. This promise gave him a goal to work towards. However, things did not go as planned. Edward Patz was dismissed from the program, and after Pat's departure, that promise of the full-time job left with him. Losing that opportunity for that steady job was a severe blow to Christopher. Already struggling with alcoholism and substance abuse, he continued to spiral even further after that disappointment at the WCC program. He reportedly began to drink even more heavily and now on a daily basis. Around this time, Scarver's mental health continued to spiral and unravel in really alarming ways. He later stated that while intoxicated, he started to hear voices, which are also known as auditory hallucinations. Scarver described hearing voices that told him, quote, he was the chosen one, end quote. In his delusions or beliefs, he came to think that he was chosen by a higher power or was some kind of divine instrument. He developed what psychiatrists later identified as messianic delusions. For instance, he felt that being named Christopher, being similar to Christ, having a mother named Mary, and having worked as a carpenter were all signs of a God-given role. If you think about it from an outside perspective, it kind of does make sense when you piece all of those things together. But for someone hallucinating, this develops into a sincere belief, not a coincidence. These thoughts clearly echoed Christian symbolism because Jesus was a carpenter with a mother named Mary, and Scarver fixated on this idea. A psychiatric evaluation eventually diagnosed Christopher Scarver with schizophrenia. For those of you that don't know, schizophrenia is a mental illness that affects your ability to think clearly and oftentimes is very disruptive to daily life. Someone diagnosed with schizophrenia may suffer from delusions, disorganized thoughts and sleep patterns, behavioral problems, paranoia, and/or hallucinations. There are many different types of hallucinations, including auditory or hearing, visual, tactile or physical, and so many more. I really want you to think about that for a second. Imagine living with a condition that can take over any of your senses and your mind. It is real to those suffering from it. This illness can be treated with medication, therapy, and additional interventions to make it more tolerable, but Christopher did not have access to these, nor did he even know that he had schizophrenia at the time. In the nursing world, I have personally cared for multiple patients with schizophrenia, and it truly does make life difficult for them in ways that you cannot imagine. For those of you that haven't seen my video on Richard Chase, the Sacramento vampire, I highly recommend that you watch it because that case also has a very strong tie to this condition as well. Something that I want to mention that many don't discuss is the correlation between substance abuse and mental health disorders, especially schizophrenia. It's one of those debatable topics, like what comes first, the chicken or the egg, but there is an association with substances triggering underlying disorders, and I cannot help but wonder if Christopher's substance abuse actually triggered this in him too. All right, that's enough nursing for now. Back to our story. Scarver's particular delusion had a grandiose religious component to it. He said that those voices that he heard reinforced this belief, telling him that he was on a divine mission and couldn't be harmed. It's important to note that this diagnosis came after the first murder that we're going to talk about during the legal proceedings to determine if he was fit to stand trial, but these symptoms had started manifesting in the months leading up to that crime and were worsening from that heavy substance abuse and stress. By early 1990, Christopher Scarver was a 20-year-old high school dropout battling alcoholism, recently unemployed from the WCC program, effectively homeless after being kicked out by his mom, and was experiencing untreated psychosis. He also had a girlfriend at the time who was reportedly pregnant with his child on top of everything else. Scarver's life was in shambles, to say the least. Friends and family later stated that he was increasingly, quote, nervous and jumpy, end quote, and really quick to anger. He himself would often say, quote, that I fear losing control, end quote, over his actions. Unfortunately, that came to fruition. Scarver was on a really dark path, and it took a turn for the worse on June 1st, 1990, in a very violent incident that would completely change the course of his life. Steve Lohman was a 27-year-old employee of the Wisconsin Conservation Corps that had newly started supervising in the program where Christopher had been training. On June 1st, 1990, Christopher Scarver decided to confront people at the WCC office in Milwaukee, mainly over his frustration about not getting that promised job or the money that he felt that he was owed. Scarver planned to get what he felt he deserved. He armed himself with a handgun before going to the WCC training program office on that fateful day. Inside the office, Christopher encountered two men, John P. Fagan, the site manager, and Steve Lohman, who actually had replaced the former supervisor that Christopher loved, Edward Patz, and tension quickly escalated. Scarver pulled out his gun and forced Lohman down to the floor at gunpoint. Pointing the weapon at Lohman and Fagan, he demanded money, and he wanted whatever funds they had on hand. Scarver specifically targeted Fagan, the manager, to hand over money because Christopher just assumed that he would have the most being the manager. $15 was all Fagan had to give to him. This is worth less than $40 today. This amount only increased Scarver's rage. He was expecting a lot more money, possibly a few hundred or maybe even $1,000. So just receiving this $15 made him feel like he wasn't being taken seriously at all. Enraged, Christopher aimed at Steve Lohman and shot him once in the head at point-blank range. The bullet struck Lohman in the head, and this injury was fatal almost instantly. According to later accounts about the incident, Scarver then calmly said to the horrified John Fagan, quote, "Do you think I'm kidding now?" As Steve Lohman laid on the ground, dying from the headshot, Scarver continued to demand more money from Fagan. He had to think quickly, so he scrambled to write a check out to him. Christopher fired his gun 2 more times into Lohman's body, even though Lohman was already clearly gone. That is just, I don't have any words. It's so heartbreaking. Those shots were confirmed to be post-mortem when forensic evidence noted the lack of bleeding from those wounds. Scarver did this to intimidate and scare Fagan into quickly writing him that check. John Fagan wrote the check to Christopher for $3,000 on the spot. In 1990, $3,000 was a massive amount of money. Today, that would be worth around $7,000. Fagan handed over that check, hoping that this would satisfy Scarver enough to end the nightmare. Fagan then ran for his life as soon as Scarver had the check and was no longer pointing the gun directly at him. As Fagan darted out of the office and towards his car, Christopher took one last shot at him. The bullet missed Fagan, and he miraculously managed to escape, speeding off, and immediately alerted the authorities about the shooting. This story is far from over, though, so don't go yet. Christopher Scarver fled the scene as well. He didn't attempt to pursue Fagan because he needed to get away quickly, too. The entire incident from robbery to murder was over in just a matter of minutes. It was later described by witnesses and investigators as a very methodical execution style slaying. Scarver had come prepared with a gun, taken control, and when dissatisfied with the outcome, he executed a man in cold blood and nearly killed another. Scarver did not get far before the police caught up with him. Authorities launched a manhunt for the armed suspect, and Christopher was arrested just a few hours later on that same day. Police found him hiding on the roof of the house, which reportedly was the roof of his girlfriend's residence. Officers arrived, and Scarver didn't resist. He was prepared to surrender. In fact, a police officer later testified that upon arrest, Christopher said that he actually planned to turn himself in because, quote, he knew what he was doing was wrong, unquote. Despite his earlier delusions of being invincible and divinely chosen, Scarver apparently had a moment of clarity after killing Lohman because he recognized the gravity of the crime and intended to give himself up rather than try to escape. Scarver was taken into custody, and that $3,000 check was now recovered as evidence along with the handgun. Steve Lohman's body was sent for an autopsy, confirming the manner of death as homicide by gunshot. John Fayen, though, was completely traumatized, but he did survive to tell the story to the police, so they knew exactly what happened. In the span of one morning, Christopher had gone from a desperate, delusional young man to a murderer facing life in prison. The next phase would be his trial, where his mental state and that chilling sequence of events would be scrutinized with extreme detail. After the murder of Steve Lohman, Christopher Scarver was charged with first-degree intentional homicide and armed robbery. The case moved through the Wisconsin court system over the next year and a half. It wasn't until 1992 that Scarver actually stood for trial for Lohman's murder because there had been delays for psychiatric evaluations and preparations for the trial. When the trial did come, Scarver's defense team raised the issue of his sanity at the time of the shooting. They pursued an insanity defense, of course, given that he was having hallucinations and delusions. During the trial, testimony was given about Scarver's mental state. A court-appointed psychiatrist had examined Scarver after the murder. Christopher was very open about his delusions during the psychiatric interview. He told the psychiatrist outright that he truly believed he was the Son of God and explained to him why. In Scarver's mind, these coincidences were not coincidences at all, but divine signs. He recounted that about a month after being fired from the WCC program, he, quote, started hearing voices, unquote, of men and women, sometimes high-pitched, which he interpreted as spiritual or angelic messages. These voices actually told him, quote, that he had been wronged, unquote, by people at the WCC and that he, quote, would receive no harm, unquote, implying that he would be protected and that he, quote, will still be the Son of God, unquote. These voices fed into his anger and gave him a sense of righteousness. He felt completely untouchable. He also stated that the voices explicitly told him, quote, I'm the chosen one, unquote. All of this was evidence for an insanity plea because it showed his grip on reality was severely impaired by psychosis at the time of the crime. Christopher had claimed to the psychiatrist that, quote, the reason I did it is because the voices told me that Lohman had done me wrong, unquote. The voices allegedly assured Scarver that killing Lohman was justified and that he wouldn't be harmed for doing it. This is a classic example of a command hallucination where a person actually hears a voice instructing them to commit an act or do something nefarious of some type. Despite the compelling evidence of mental illness, the insanity defense was unsuccessful. In early 1992, a Wisconsin jury rejected that plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. They found him legally sane and fully responsible for his actions at the time of the murder. This meant that while Christopher clearly had mental health issues, the jury was not convinced that his psychosis was severe enough to meet the legal criteria for insanity. The fact that Scarver prepared for the crime by bringing a gun, demanding the money, and fled afterward might have suggested a level of planning and awareness that goes directly against that insanity argument. Also, his statement about knowing that it was wrong and intending to turn himself in could also kind of hurt the insanity claim as well because it shows that he understood what he was doing was wrong. I feel super conflicted about this, but let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. So, in April 1992, Christopher Scarver was convicted of first-degree murder for killing Stephen Lohman. Scarver was sentenced to life in prison for Lohman's murder. Scarver would not even be eligible for parole until the year 2042, which is effectively a 50-year minimum term before any possibility of release. It was pretty much guaranteed that Christopher, which he was about 22 at that time, would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Scarver was sent to begin serving his life sentence at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. Columbia is a maximum security state prison. Coincidentally, around that very same time that Scarver arrived in 1992, another new high-profile inmate would soon be housed at Columbia, Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee cannibal serial killer who was convicted and sentenced in Wisconsin that very same year. During his period of early incarceration, Scarver's schizophrenia was documented, and he did receive some psychiatric evaluations and receive treatment with medication. Being in a structured prison environment might actually have kept him stable to somewhat of a degree, but it's known that Scarver continued to experience delusions and had difficulty adjusting. He spent some time in solitary confinement even prior to 1994 due to behavioral issues linked to his mental illness. But for about 2 years, nothing occurred that drew any bad attention. That would change drastically in late 1994 when Scarver's path collided with Jeffrey Dahmer and Jesse Anderson in a deadly confrontation that made headlines. Jeffrey Dahmer was sent to the same prison as Christopher after being sentenced to 16 life terms for 17 murders that he committed between 1978 to 1991. Let me know down in the comments below if that's a case that you'd be interested in me covering at length, which I would do so separately because we're just going to touch on him today. Dahmer was one of the most infamous criminals in American history, given the shocking nature of his crimes, most of which happened to men of color. The prison officials were acutely aware that Dahmer could be a target for violence by other inmates. In fact, for Dahmer's first year in prison, he was kept in protective isolation for his own safety. During that time, he had minimal contact with the general population. He was actually housed in a solitary cell, and whenever he was moved, he was escorted by at least one guard. This was to prevent any attacks on him, since people like him are often despised by fellow prisoners because of the crimes that he committed. After about a year, Dahmer requested to leave solitary confinement and join the general population, reportedly because he had then become a born-again Christian and accepted whatever fate might come to him. Prison authorities, evaluating that things had calmed down, eventually allowed Dahmer to have some more interactions with other inmates in the prison. By late 1993 and into 1994, Dahmer was then officially living among the general population at Columbia. In July of 1994, there was one attempt on Dahmer's life. Another inmate tried to cut Dahmer's carotid and jugular with a makeshift plastic knife during a chapel service. Dahmer received only a minor wound from that incident. The attacker, inmate Osvaldo DeRuthi, was quickly restrained. This incident showed that Dahmer still had enemies and was still at risk, but the prison administration just brushed it off as a one-time incident. They did not move Dahmer back into permanent protective custody after that. Wisconsin's correction secretary at the time, Michael Sullivan, commented that within Columbia Prison, plenty of inmates were murderers, and Dahmer was one of many there. They thought that he really didn't stand out amongst the group. That thought underestimated the depth of hatred that some felt towards him, though. Now, during this period of time, Christopher Scarver had become acutely aware of Jeffrey Dahmer's presence in that prison. It was impossible not to, though. Dahmer's crimes had been in every newspaper and on every TV in the country. Scarver later said that he kept his distance from Dahmer initially. He was very wary of that famous serial killer, not out of fear of Dahmer attacking him, because Dahmer actually wasn't known to be violent towards other inmates, but because Dahmer had, quote, a disturbing sense of humor, end quote, and enjoyed provoking other inmates. Multiple accounts, including Scarver's later on in interviews, described how Dahmer would taunt other prisoners. Dahmer had a morbid sense of humor. For instance, he would arrange his prison food to resemble limbs, shaping them to look like fake human body parts and then drizzle ketchup all over them to simulate blood to show it off to other inmates. He found this prank hilarious, but many inmates found it disturbing, infuriating, and grotesque, especially knowing what he did to people. Scarver in particular was, quote, fiercely disgusted, end quote, by this behavior. In his own words, quote, he, Dahmer, crossed the line with people. Prisoners, prison staff, some people who are in that prison are repentant, but he was not one of them, end quote. Christopher perceived Dahmer as lacking any sense of genuine remorse. He felt that it was all for show. Another significant factor in today's case is racial tension. Scarver is Black, and the majority of Dahmer's victims had been young men of color. They were either Black, Asian, or Mexican. Within the prison, it was noted that many Black inmates viewed Dahmer as a killer who had targeted non-white victims. Milwaukee's District Attorney E. Michael McCann also stated that during Dahmer's trial, Black inmates at the county jail had expressed that Dahmer had a figurative target on his back in prison because of this. Christopher shared in this outrage at Dahmer's targeting of Black victims. Additionally, Jesse Anderson, the other inmate involved in the 1994 incident, was a white man who murdered his wife and attempted to frame 2 Black men for the crime, fabricating a story that Black assailants did this to her. This was a very recent, high-profile case in Wisconsin at that time as well. Anderson was convicted in 1992, also around the same time as Scarver and Dahmer's trials. Also, let me know if you'd be interested in me covering that case as well. So, from Scarver's perspective, he was surrounded by 2 notorious white criminals who had been targeting people of color. One who preyed on them, Dahmer specifically, and another who tried to pin his crime on them, Anderson. Scarver's mental state in 1994 remained fragile. He was medicated for schizophrenia, but he was still having delusions and intense emotions. He reportedly carried a newspaper clipping in his pocket that detailed Dahmer's gruesome crimes. This just tells you how preoccupied his thoughts were in regards to Dahmer's case. Scarver said that he, quote, bore a deep disgust, end quote, for Dahmer because of these highly publicized details. He watched Dahmer from afar in the yard or the cafeteria, but never approached him. Scarver later recalled, quote, I never interacted with him. I always stayed away. I didn't want to be a target of one of his sick jokes, end quote. However, avoiding someone in prison has its limits, especially when you can be assigned to work together. By late 1994, Christopher had been at Columbia for over 2 years without any violent incidents, but the stage was set for a confrontation, and there was already bad blood simmering. All it would take was an opportunity, a hallucination, or a trigger. November 28, 1994 was a Monday morning at the tail end of the Thanksgiving holiday weekend. On that morning, Christopher Scarver was assigned to a routine work assignment along with 2 other inmates. Those 2 inmates happened to be, you guessed it, Jeffrey Dahmer and Jesse Anderson. The 3 of them were directed to clean the bathrooms and the showers in the gym area. Normally, this would be supervised by correctional officers both for security reasons and to ensure that the work actually gets done. That morning, an officer escorted the trio to the gym and then, strangely, left them unsupervised for a period of time. It's not entirely clear why no guards stayed, but some reports suggest that it was only for a short period of time, possibly due to a lapse in coverage. Regardless, Scarver, Dahmer, and Anderson suddenly found themselves alone in the gym at 7:50 in the morning. The chain of events that followed has been reconstructed from Scarver's own accounts and the prison investigation. According to Scarver, as the 3 inmates began their cleaning, he was filling up a mop bucket with water in the bathroom area. While he was bent over or distracted with the bucket, he suddenly felt someone poke him in the back from behind, and it was just a sudden jabbing motion. He spun around to see who it was. Behind him were Jeffrey Dahmer and Jesse Anderson, and Scarver observed them laughing under their breath as if they had just played a prank on him. It's important to note that Scarver said he, quote, couldn't tell which one had done it, end quote. Both Dahmer and Anderson were chuckling, though. Scarver felt provoked. Being touched or poked from behind can really be startling in prison. In this case, given Scarver's wariness and anger of them already, this was enough to set him off. Scarver said he looked them in the eyes to try to discern guilt, but both avoided direct confrontation at that moment. Neither Dahmer nor Anderson apologized. They just split up and went about their assigned chores. As he later put it, quote, they were kind of laughing under their breath. I looked right into their eyes, and I couldn't tell which of them had done it, end quote. In his mind, they were teaming up against him to mock him. Jeffrey Dahmer proceeded toward the staff locker room area to clean there, and Jesse Anderson went towards a different area, and Scarver was left stewing. Scarver then made a fateful decision. He left his cleaning assignment and went into the weight room adjacent to the gym. There, he found a piece of exercise equipment that he could use as a weapon. Specifically, Christopher grabbed a 20-inch long metal bar that was described as a steel bar weighing about 5 pounds from a Nautilus weight machine. Ironically, just months earlier, the prison authorities had removed free weightlifting equipment due to security concerns, but fixed weight machines were still there, so they still had access to the bars. He took this metal bar and concealed it in his clothing, reportedly tucking it into his pants and somewhat under his jacket, and then went to follow Dahmer. Scarver entered the staff locker room where Dahmer was working, cornering Dahmer inside. According to Christopher's account, as Dahmer realized Scarver was approaching, Dahmer looked surprised and completely uneasy. Scarver blocked the exit door and pulled out the clipping, demanding Dahmer to confirm what it said. He said, quote, I asked him if he actually did those things because I was fiercely disgusted, end quote. He challenged Dahmer about the monstrous murders and horrifying things that he had done to them after describing it in that article. Dahmer, taken completely off guard, was shocked. Scarver said that Dahmer's eyes widened in realization of what was about to happen. Dahmer apparently mumbled out a very subtle and quiet yes. At this point, Dahmer quickly panicked and started looking for an escape route. Scarver recalls that Dahmer, quote, started looking for a door to run to pretty quickly, end quote, but Scarver had positioned himself to block Dahmer's path out of that locker room. There was nowhere for Dahmer to run. What happened next was a sudden eruption of violence. Scarver swung the metal bar with full force at Jeffrey Dahmer's head. He struck Dahmer twice, delivering 2 massive blows to Dahmer's skull and face. The results were severe and fatal. Dahmer crumpled to the floor, bleeding profusely. Scarver later said, quote, he ended up dead. I put his head down, end quote. Christopher smashed his skull in with those 2 swings. One of those strikes reportedly caused Dahmer's skull to collapse with the force. Dahmer lost consciousness immediately and was left critically injured, barely clinging to life. In fact, one guard later saw the scene and said Dahmer was found, quote, in a huge pool of blood with very severe, extensive head injuries, end quote. The blows were so ferocious that blood had spattered all over the area. Scarver even stated that Dahmer was left gurgling on the floor. This is the kind of almost agonal breathing that you might hear from someone after a massive head trauma. It's possible that Dahmer's brain was fatally damaged immediately at that point, but his heart hadn't stopped yet, so he was making involuntary noises, and this is normal. He then exited the staff locker room, leaving Dahmer on the floor dying. Scarver now sought out his second target, Jesse Anderson. Anderson was in a nearby restroom shower area of the gym doing his part of the cleaning assignment. Scarver approached Anderson with the very same weapon. He attacked Anderson and began bludgeoning him brutally as well. Accounts differ slightly on what weapon Scarver used on Anderson. Some say that he used that same metal bar on Anderson, and others say that he picked up a wooden stick or a broken broom handle in the restroom for Anderson. Either way, Scarver beat Jesse Anderson severely, focusing on his head just as he did with Dahmer. The assault on Anderson was also merciless and very quick. Anderson was a 37-year-old man with an average build and had no chance to fight back or flee. Christopher was younger, larger, and armed. He struck Anderson multiple times, cracking his skull as well and inflicting grave head wounds. In Scarver's later description, quote, pretty much the same thing happened as with Dahmer. He got his head put out too, unquote. Similar to what brought him to the prison, the entire episode was over in about 20 minutes. No prison staff were present during either of the attacks, according to Scarver. He later alleged that the guards had deliberately left the area and timed their absence, implying a conspiracy. He said, quote, they had something to do with what took place, unquote. He said this to a reporter, suggesting that the correctional officers hated Dahmer too and wanted Scarver to do what he did, and they knew he would. However, an official investigation didn't find any evidence to support that claim. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, because we know conspiracies sometimes are true. He then returned the bloodied metal bar to the weight room, slipping it back into the exercise machine that he had taken it from. Then he calmly walked away from the scene and headed back towards his cell in another part of the prison. On the way, he encountered a correctional officer. The officer, seeing Christopher unescorted and presumably covered with a lot of blood spatter on him, asked Scarver why he was back so early from work. Scarver then made his now infamous declaration, quote, God told me to do it. You'll hear about it on the 6 o'clock news. Jesse Anderson and Jeffrey Dahmer are dead, end quote. This statement echoed what he said in 1990, reinforcing that he felt a divine duty to commit these acts. The guard immediately apprehended Scarver and sounded the alarm. Chaos erupted as staff rushed to the gym, and they found a very gruesome scene. In the locker room, Jeffrey Dahmer was lying on the floor, bleeding heavily from head wounds and was unresponsive, but still somewhat alive. In the shower area, Jesse was also discovered unconscious, brutally beaten with severe head trauma, and was barely clinging to life. There was blood everywhere on the concrete floors of those bathrooms. Emergency medical responders were called. Jeffrey Dahmer was still somewhat breathing when found and had a very weak heartbeat, and he was still agonally breathing, like I mentioned earlier. EMTs and officers transported him to a nearby hospital called Divine Savior Hospital in Portage as quickly as possible. I can't be the only one that finds that hospital name ironic and eerie after Scarver was saying that this was an act of God. Dahmer, 34 years old, was pronounced dead about 1 hour after arriving at the hospital, which would have been around 9 a.m. that morning. The autopsy of Dahmer's body would later show the full extent of his injuries. Dahmer had suffered multiple skull fractures and severe brain trauma consistent with being struck by a heavy object. Dahmer's face and head were so badly injured that they said that they were completely beyond recognition. It was a brutal, violent death, ironically mirroring some of the violence that he had inflicted on others during his life. Jesse Anderson, meanwhile, was transported to the University of Wisconsin Hospital in Madison. He had a faint pulse when he was found, and doctors put him on life support in the intensive care unit. Anderson's head injuries were also massive. He had been beaten into a coma from which he would not recover. For 2 days, he lingered in critical condition there. Finally, on November 30th, 1994, Anderson's family agreed to remove him from life support or the ventilator after it was really clear that there was no brain activity. Jesse Anderson, age 37, was pronounced dead that same day. The manner of death was the same: homicide by blunt force trauma to the skull. His skull had been crushed very similarly. In another disturbing coincidence, Anderson's death mirrored that of his wife, the victim that he had killed in 1992, because she also died of head injuries 2 days after being attacked, and now Anderson died of head injuries 2 days after his attack. The murderer had become a murder victim in the very same fate. Back at Columbia Correctional Institution, Scarver was immediately separated and placed under tight security following both of the assaults. News of Jeffrey Dahmer's violent demise spread rapidly that day, making headlines worldwide by that evening. Many members of the public, including families of Dahmer's victims, felt some sense of relief or even satisfaction that Dahmer had met a very bloody and brutal end. Some said that it was poetic justice or that he got what he deserved. The prosecutor for Dahmer's case, however, cautioned against celebrating, remarking, quote, "I just hope that some guy doesn't emerge as the self-proclaimed folk hero for killing Dahmer. Dahmer's death was still a murder," end quote. That some guy that he was alluding to, of course, was Christopher Scarver, who indeed began to see himself as somewhat of an avenger figure. Within the prison system, the double killing raised serious questions. Investigations were launched into how this could have happened. The Wisconsin Department of Corrections emphasized that there was no official plot to have killed Dahmer and that it was simply a failure of procedure that inmates ended up together alone. The Columbia prison warden and officers were highly scrutinized, but ultimately not charged with anything. Christopher did not accuse any specific guard of setting him up, but he did insinuate to reporters that the circumstances were too convenient. We may never know if there was any encouragement from staff, and it remains a controversial point, but what is clear is that Christopher Scarver acted on his own desires, fueled by his long-standing anger and delusions. He later explained multiple motives. He absolutely despised Dahmer's lack of remorse and grotesque behavior, like we talked about earlier. Additionally, racial motivations likely played a significant role as well. We cannot ignore that Scarver's schizophrenia was a significant factor too. His statement, quote, "God told me to do it," end quote, was not just a phrase. It was literal to him as a manifestation of his chronic delusions, and he was acting on divine instruction. During later interviews, he also claimed that prison staff intentionally left him with the men, which fed into that conspiracy belief that was consistent with paranoia. So Scarver's actions on November 28, 1994 appeared to be a product of both rational and irrational drives. Rational hatred for two despised inmates and an irrational sense of an ordained mission from the voices that he was hearing in his head. From a strictly factual perspective, what Christopher did was commit 2 cold-blooded murders in prison. Despite any popular opinion that he did society a favor by eliminating Dahmer, the law would treat it the same way. Scarver was immediately the prime and only suspect. There were no other perpetrators, and he himself never denied his responsibility. Because of the murders, Christopher Scarver was moved to a very highly secure environment. Initially, he was held at a segregation unit in Wisconsin prison while the investigation proceeded and charges were prepared. Psychiatrists evaluated Scarver after the incident to determine his competency once again to stand trial. Given his history, the court had to ensure that he understood the charges and could assist in his own defense. The evaluation concluded that he was competent to stand trial, meaning that once again, despite his mental illness, he was capable of understanding the legal proceedings and the nature of the acts that he committed. Scarver was charged with 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide for the murders of Jeffrey Dahmer and Jesse Anderson. Originally, he entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, which is not surprising because his delusions were ongoing. However, the case did not go through a full jury trial this time. The defense and the prosecutor struck a plea agreement. Scarver agreed to change his plea to no contest to the 2 murder charges. That plea of no contest meant that he didn't argue against the charges, which basically is an acceptance of conviction without an admission of guilt. In exchange, Christopher negotiated that he would be transferred out of Wisconsin state prison system to a federal prison facility. This was something that Scarver actually had already wanted, likely because he felt that Wisconsin prisons would treat him very harshly and different after killing these 2 notorious killers. Christopher harbored and still harbors distrust towards Wisconsin prison officials, so a deal that sent him to a federal prison was a good bargaining chip for him. In May of 1995, Christopher Scarver was formally convicted on both counts of murder for Dahmer and Anderson and was sentenced to 2 additional life sentences to run concurrently. At a sentencing hearing, when asked if he had anything to say or if he even considered the sentencing fair, Scarver stated, quote, "Nothing white people do to blacks is just," end quote. This comment reiterated that he had been feeling this way all along. The addition of 2 life terms didn't change anything for him about his fate. He was already in for life without the hope of parole. In 1995, shortly after the sentencing, Christopher was transferred into the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Wisconsin officials actually welcomed this. They had expressed that they didn't have a facility that was secure enough to safely house him, given his notoriety and mental health needs. First, he was sent for psychiatric evaluations in Missouri, and then he was transferred to ADX Florence Supermax Prison in Colorado. ADX Florence is the highest security federal prison in the United States, known for housing the most dangerous and infamous inmates in solitary conditions. Scarver remained at ADX Florence for about 5 years between 1995 and 2000. In 2000, Wisconsin built a new supermax prison of its own called the Wisconsin Secure Program Facility, or the WSPF. Christopher was then brought back to that new facility. However, conditions there were really harsh. Scarver and around 3 dozen other seriously mentally ill inmates struggled there. In 2001, a federal judge, Barbara Crabb, reviewed a class action lawsuit about the treatment of mentally ill inmates and ordered many of them, including Scarver, be relocated out of the Wisconsin Supermax. The judge found that subjecting these inmates to complete isolation was actually worsening their conditions. As a result, Christopher Scarver was then moved back to Colorado in the early 2000s. He ended up at the Centennial Correction Facility in Canyon City, Colorado. Scarver would later claim that as a result of killing Dahmer and Anderson, he spent 16 years in solitary confinement. From 1994 to 2010, he was always in isolated housing, whether at ADX or WSPF. This prolonged isolation took a huge toll on him. In 2005, he filed a federal lawsuit against Wisconsin officials, arguing that his conditions, especially at WSPF, amounted to cruel and unusual punishment, and he had severely aggravated his mental illness by being there. This case did not succeed. A judge dismissed some of the claims and ruled that the remaining conditions, while harsh, didn't meet the legal threshold of unconstitutional treatment given the justifications. Scarver appealed, but in 2006, the appellate court upheld the dismissal. Christopher Scarver is now in his mid-50s, and he remains incarcerated at the Centennial Correctional Facility in Colorado, serving 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of release. He stays out of the spotlight for the most part, but occasionally his name resurfaces in the media. For example, in 2015, when he gave an interview after 20 years of silence, explaining why he killed Dahmer, and again in 2022, when interest in Dahmer's story was revived by the Netflix series that we've probably all seen here. Scarver mentioned in that interview that he still believes prison guards deliberately left him alone with Dahmer, but he won't elaborate out of fear of retaliation. He also told a reporter that perhaps eating too much refined sugar in prison contributed to his aggression and hallucinations, but it's not backed by medical evidence. Scarver's story is really complicated. To many, he's always going to be the man who killed Jeffrey Dahmer, almost a folk hero who avenged Dahmer's victims. After the 2022 TV series about Dahmer, Christopher reportedly received thank you letters from people who saw him as having delivered justice that the system didn't fully provide. Some family members of Dahmer's victims expressed that they were glad Dahmer died violently. On the other hand, Scarver is also a man who killed an innocent victim, Steve Lohman, in cold blood, leaving that family in grief. And he killed a second man, Anderson, who, despite his crimes, was a husband and a father whose children also lost him too due to his own wrongdoing originally. In prison, taking justice into your own hands is still murder, and Scarver's actions could also be viewed as those of a mentally unstable individual acting out violent delusions. We really can't tell Scarver's story without acknowledging the victims at every turn, though. Steve Lohman lost his life at 27 working at a job that he was trying to help youths with. He was described by those who knew him as a kind man that was dedicated to service. Barbara Anderson, the wife of Jesse, was slain by her husband, and then her husband met that same fate. This cycle of violence orphaned their children. Jeffrey Dahmer, while notorious and monstrous, was also a son and a brother. His own father and stepmother had to confront his brutal end too. After Dahmer's death, his parents fought over his remains. His brain was even preserved for a while at his mother's request for possible scientific studies of what made him a serial killer until a judge actually ordered the brain destroyed and the remains cremated in 1995. Christopher Scarver's story forces us to contemplate difficult questions like what drives a person to kill? How should the justice system handle someone with severe mental illness who becomes violent? Is there ever room for vigilante justice, as some feel Dahmer's killing was, or should the law prevail even behind prison walls? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. One thing we do know is that Christopher Scarver will spend the rest of his life behind bars for the 3 murders that he has now committed. I feel really conflicted about today's case, similar to my thoughts in the Richard Chase case, because mental health really does add a whole complicated layer to these scenarios. I know this was a lot to keep up with, so I'm very grateful if you stuck it out to the end and watched this far, so thank you. Don't forget to drop me a blue butterfly in the chat as our sacred handshake, and please have an amazing week. Nurse's orders. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.